I interviewed you last year, you've made more videos about the national dividend.
Yeah.
I've viewed those and I think there are more questions to be answered.
I'm sure that's true and we need to address them. But before we do that, I've written a one-page exposition of what a national dividend is and how it works. And I think we should read that so people have got an outline of what we're really talking about before we answer questions about it.
That's a great idea. Let's do that.
All dividends are a distribution of profits. Corporate profits are distributed every day in the business world, but are nations profitable, is the question.
A few Australians set out to measure this. Because US statistics are more comprehensively available, it was decided to measure national profitability here. A profit and loss account for the United States was done privately in Australia for the year 2014. Using US Federal Reserve Economic Data, FRED, the US Bureau of Economic Assessment Statistics, and some private research, the profitability of the United States was affirmed.
The news is wonderful, really. It's even magnificent.
It showed that while 12.5 trillion of consumer goods were both produced and sold, the total aggregate income of all persons was only 10.1 trillion. This sum of consumer production, over and above the total incomes paid to induce it, amounted to 2.4 trillion in total, and to $7,500 per person, or $30,000 per American family of four.
Incredibly, the production of consumer goods was above incomes by an amount of $7,500 per living American.
The excess of consumer production over consumer incomes was financed by the United States' total indebtedness, increasing in 2014 by 2.3 trillion. Because America is profitable each year, it has to increase its debt each year to finance the consumption of that part of its consumer production, which its incomes will not buy. Failing this, the nation would go into recession and eventually into economic depression.
This debt was supplied by the Reserve Bank in association with the private banks, creating new and additional money and distributing it as a debt owing to the banks themselves. And this is a regular occurrence every year now.
It might as easily have been supplied by a national credit authority with court-like powers, both calculating the national dividend and empowered to distribute it to all persons in equal measure and without discrimination. It would be distributed as a dividend, that is, debt-free and without any interest or fees charged.
Yeah, this finances a large measure of basic income without anybody being taxed and without the national debt being increased.
All banks would be restrained from funding consumption as debt, to the extent that it is now being funded by the national dividend. No more money is being created here. The same amount as is normal would be created, though in a different way. This avoids double funding consumption and creating demand inflation, and being created without any need for repayment or interest. There is no cost push inflation either.
The banks would continue to finance production and do so with limited regulation.
Any inadequacy of the national dividend would be supplemented with social security funded by taxation in the normal way. While this appeals to most, it may displease some vested interests.
And no other persons that we could identify as being disadvantaged by a national dividend.
Well, that's quite a succinct introduction.
Yeah.
Let's start addressing some questions. You say the modern nations are usually profitable. How long have nations been profitable?
The first one of which I'm absolutely confident was about 5,000 years ago, when the Egyptians were building the Pyramid of Giza. They had to quarry it, dress it, transport it, and put a multiple ton stone in place less than every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 20 years to build that thing. And obviously they had an abundance of food above the energy they used to grow it, and shelter and clothing and all the rest of it. So it's been like that in most societies ever since.
So who directed that the national dividend would be used to build pyramids?
Well, this was a result of the political and religious leadership deciding what was going to happen. The national dividend was actually stolen, if you like, or appropriated certainly, by the Pharaoh and the religious leaders of the day, and they decided they're going to build these strange structures. The national dividend or national profitability continued to be used in that way, normally by both, say in medieval Europe, the political leadership built forts and they built castles, and the religious leadership built cathedrals. But things have changed since then, and who decides what happens now? The church or religious leaders have very little say or very little input. It was government and religious leaders, then it became government and finance, but now really finance makes the decisions and government is very secondary.
Many people see politics as a competition between left and right. Which side is the policy of the national dividend on?
I used to say it was on neither side, but I've come to the conclusion that I should say it's on both sides, because the left, or the people that vote and regard themselves as leftists, they often see themselves as being compassionate and favouring a more equitable distribution of income. Well, the national dividend does that. And on the other hand, the Conservatives or the right are very adamant that paying dividends is legitimate. It's not something for nothing. It's a reward for past efforts and application and restraint and all those virtues. So we're pleasing them also by saying, well, we're paying a national dividend. So I think we're on both sides, and I don't think we're against either of them.
You are not much into the left versus right connection. You've said that capitalism versus socialism was a distraction, a red herring, promoted by those who have a private monopoly of creating money. Do people believe you when you say this?
They struggle with it because they're looking into a different world. It's like the old story about the prince and the pauper. The pauper's in the street, he's hungry, he's cold, he doesn't have a warm bed at night. And when he looks at the prince, he sees all those things that he doesn't have. The prince, on the other hand, he might have all those things, but he hardly gives it a thought, because he's trying to defend himself from his neighbours that are very likely to commit acts of war against him, and he's got diplomatic problems and everybody trying to inveigle him to get advantage. So he lives in a world of different stresses. People can't really believe that government has given private interests the right to create all our money and keep it. And they can't really understand what that would be like, the power that it confers. And it's really, really despotic if they want to pursue it in that way. They can basically buy anything that money can buy, and that's a lot. It's media, it's influence in politics, it's influence with universities, and it's just a different world. And sure, they struggle to understand just how powerful the right to create credit is.
So you think that this policy of distracting us is continuing? And if so, what form and purpose does it have?
Well, the distractions that they put before us now, they depended largely on the contention between capitalism and socialism to preoccupy us all for a long time. What they're doing now is they're distracting us with a more diverse range of issues. The traditional ancient one that's been there forever, of course, is bread and circuses, goes right back to Roman times. But there are also a whole lot of other issues that they throw before it, like global warming and euthanasia and transgenderism and a lot of these sort of issues. They don't, I think, care what side we take or what attitude we take them, as long as we're preoccupied with them. Because the key issue is who's creating credit, who owns it all, how are they directing it, how are they allocating it, what is their policy. And their policy will be quite different to government. I mean, they have a lot of leverage on government, government has pretty much acquiesced to the pressure of the media, on whom they are so dependent. They're dependent on money and they're dependent on the media because the media can destroy careers so easily.
So how did this business of creating society's money and controlling human beings avoid attention for so long?
Well, the key thing, of course, was that they could influence the press. I mean, they could have any influence they like. Most of the magnates now, in the United States, I understand there are only 6 organisations that own 95% of the media. They're generally financed by banks and dependent on banks. And so that was a big factor. They just don't talk about these things, and therefore the people don't really get to focus on it. It's changing a little with YouTube such as ours, but it's going to be slow, and it doesn't have the prestige of the big media crawling all over issues, getting everybody excited about them. There are other factors that I think played into it. One was that during the time when the church was being pushed away from having arbitration over moral issues, the church was pretty confused about the deficiency of purchasing power, which is really the profitability of society, because it's not a problem that's been developed from sin. It's actually a problem that's come about because of virtue. People are virtuous, they ply themselves, they restrain themselves from unharmonious practices, and so they've developed this deficiency of purchasing power. With the banks being given the right to create all that money, government has said, well, this is legal. What's legal is what government says is legal. And they've made it legal to create the whole of society's money. And if, to those that accept that there's a separation of church and state, then the church had to back off, saying, well, listen, state, you've done this wrong. Now, when you get into higher considerations, allowing all money to be appropriated by private interests and disinheriting the whole population is immoral. It's unjust. It's despotic. It's many things, but it is legal if the government says it's legal. So as a result of this, the leadership of the church is gone. It's over. They've abandoned the ship. The finances stepped up with their ideas about how the world should be run, and possibly we need something like a world government, and they've got all these ideas. And government itself, really, they acquiesce. In terms of the money supply, how it operates, who gets the benefit from it, the government they've abdicated. They're not there. They're not present.
How do you answer then the charge that the national dividend is something for nothing?
Well, it is something for nothing in the sense that banks don't grow any potatoes. They don't pour any metal. They don't weave any clothes. But they get it all for nothing. So it's something for nothing in that sense. Ordinary people, they grow all the potatoes. They fashion all the industrial goods. They make the cloth and build the homes. But they don't get access to any of that other than as debt and debt-bearing interest.
So many monetary reformers have appealed for debt-free credit to be issued for public works. Do you think that's the way to go?
It's a very temporary fix. It's been done a number of times in history. It was done with the Bank of Canada at one stage. In Australia, the Commonwealth Bank issued money, very cheap money, to fight the First World War, to build a transcontinental railway for nothing, for no cost of in terms of taxation. The great difficulty with this is that people don't notice when the practice is stopped. You know, we got the benefit of a great deal of things being funded. Even coastal shipping was funded at one stage. But once a new government came along and acquiesced to the bank's wishes, and stopped funding things at 5/7 of 1%, and most of, well, the First World War was financed at 5/7 of 1%. Once that was stopped, nobody really noticed because they weren't personally being denied anything. And it was funded then by debt, but even the consequences of that were years in coming to fruition. So that's the difficulty. If you instead pay a national dividend, once it's paid and been paid for a few years and we accept that that's how things are done, it would be a bit like abolishing all age pensions. Every age pensioner would let you know all about it. His family would know all about it. The whole community would be absolutely in uproar about it, and it couldn't be done. This is a one-way street. It might be very difficult to do it, but I'll tell you, once it's done, it'll be a lot more difficult to take it away than it is to get it, and it's difficult enough to get it.
So, is gold a universal fetish, and therefore should it be honoured with little respect?
Yeah, there is a point of view that there's something magical about gold. In my last video, I pointed out that all the gold that's been mined in the world forms a cube only 20 metres by 20 metres by 20 metres high. That's all there is since we began mining. It's interesting that when Captain Cook was in Tahiti, I think it was Joseph Banks conducted an experiment. He got a table and he put some gold coins, some silver coins, some copper coins and some steel nails on this table and said to them, if you could take 2 or 3 of these, which would it be? And they all took the nails. And those that, when the nails were gone, they opted for the copper. Gold and silver have got no natural and innate, okay, they're a bit decorative, but that's about the nature of the matter. The Chinese were probably more interested in jade than they were in gold in earlier times. So the gold thing is over. It's never been other than a myth anyhow. It's never represented more than about 1% of money. They said it was gold back, but it never was.
Has there ever been a revolt against the monopoly of credit?
There have been a couple, and actually both of them were associated with media. In the United Kingdom, there was a journal. It was probably the foremost intellectual journal of its time. It was funded originally by socialists. George Bernard Shaw put up the half the money. The fellow they got to run it was Arthur Orridge, and he was very able. And he not only ran a lot of intellectual material about philosophy and politics and economics, he also had a lot of cultural material there on, you know, the opera and art and all the rest of it. And that had quite a following. Now, Arthur Orridge took that journal on the basis that he owned it and he had absolute control of it because he didn't want to be contradicted by others, you know. So he got it on really good terms. He ran into the thinking of a fellow called C.H. Douglas, and within 24 hours, he understood something of the national dividend and other recommendations that Douglas made. And so he really took a lot of those intellectuals into appreciation of what we're on about. It was a different age. They read a lot more than we do now. And it established a movement which they called the social credit movement. Now, the other revolt happened in Canada, in the province of Alberta, where they were absolutely desperate at the height of the Depression. They were a wheat growing province, and wheat was worth almost nothing. About the only market they had for it, they were burning it in the coal trains at the time. It was sort of cheaper than mining coal. That was done through the radio, actually, because it's a very cold place. It can get down -20 there, no worries, in the winter. And they were poor, so the radio was something they could more or less have access to for nothing. There was a fellow that used to give Sunday talks of a religious nature, usually, and his name was Bill Overhart. And he started to cotton on to this business of creating money and we've got to do things differently. And everybody was desperate. So he started talking about that. And believe it or not, the first time that the party he established stood for the local provincial elections, out of 64 seats, they won 58. It was, it was one of those things that couldn't go anywhere. Okay, it was revolt, they won a provincial government, rah, rah, wonderful. But the provinces in Canada have no control over banking. It's Australian states do, but Canadian provinces don't. So it was like really electing a local government to try to control foreign policy. It just, the sanctions weren't there. They put up 24 different bills trying to do something, but they were all overruled.
If any leader or government anywhere does a proper set of national accounts, what will happen?
I think capitalism is going to survive while ever personal responsibility in managing productive assets is needful. But having said that, once we do a set of national accounts, a lot of things are going to be obvious. Like, okay, our production of consumer items was 10, our incomes are 8. What are we going to do? You know. Now, some bright spark will say, I know, we'll get the banks to create $2, own it, and just rent it to us, and we'll enslave ourselves to them. And oh, that's a brilliant idea, let's do that. And we come around the next year and we've got the book saying that we're profitable yet again. Oh, what are we going to panic? You know, we can't afford to buy all our production. We're going to go into recession. This is a disaster. What are we going to do? Oh, we'll get those banks to create a bit more debt. We'll owe them some more, but well, we have to cop that, and then we can do our little bit. So you go through a process. I don't think that'll last. Once the books are being done, you see, government is so overawed, so beaten down on this issue, they won't even do a set of books to find out what the situation is. You know, every company will do that. Directors of public companies go to jail if they don't do a comprehensive set of books. Governments will never dare to do it. They don't want to know because it's not their business in there. They've handed over control of finance to the banking system, and they will not go there. They won't even find out what the situation is. They don't want to know. So I think if we do a set of books, that will start to change our whole attitude and it'll become more apparent. So ultimately, it's the truth that'll set us free and not revolution or violence or politics or any other thing.
So what about the national balance sheet? You haven't said much about that.
No, I haven't, and it's important. It is important to attend to that. Very few nations do national balance sheets. Canada has done some, and Australia did one in 2012. They are pretty poorly done, really. Neither of them list the greatest asset that those countries had. Neither of them put any value at all on people. People were valueless, apparently. And if all we do is look at what's been spent on vocational training and education and multiply that out and look at the actuarial value, like it's worth, and look at the experiential appreciation of that once somebody's qualified as a bricklayer or a doctor, 10 years down the track, they're better qualified. If you just value that, what's been spent on vocational training, that becomes the largest asset just from that point of view. I'm not talking about, I mean, it's in a sense putting a value on people is a bit crazy, but if we're spending all this money on education, we have apparently come to the conclusion that it's a good investment, that it has value, so we need to be recognising that value. That's one thing. The other thing, if you do a balance sheet properly, is you start to see that liabilities on a national balance sheet are those things that make demands upon the assets. Now, money in my pocket is my ability to make demands on others, and their money is their right to make demands on me and on others. From a national point of view, money is a liability. And because politicians can't understand this, and most economists are confused about it as well, look at the situation, say, where we sell a farm to foreign interests. The balance sheet will have an asset less, the value of the farm. It will have foreign exchange, an extra asset. So they trade the farm for foreign exchange. They lose an asset on the balance sheet, they get one. But then the farmer has to be paid. So they have to create counterpart funds to that foreign exchange, and they pay the farmer. So what we end up with one asset less, one asset more, and one liability more, the extra money that has to be created. So every time we sell a farm, we are poorer by the full value of what we've sold. Now this is a bit amazing, and politicians just don't get it. There are other implications about imports and exports, and it's the truth that's going to allow them to sort that out, nothing else.
What role will banks play after the national dividend is paid?
They'll always finance production, and that'll be on the basis they take responsibility, and if losses are incurred, they'll be liable for them. But their role in financing consumption will be much reduced. The shortfall in effective demand is going to be funded by a national dividend. It can't also be funded by banks, otherwise we'd be double funding consumption and we'd have demand inflation. So they're going to have to be restrained from funding a good deal of consumption, and ultimately as we get experience that will probably be restricted more and more to the point where they will not really be funding consumption. That'll be happening through the national dividend and perhaps one or two other techniques. But in production, they'll be right there, not regulated very much, and they'll be responsible for making sure that production and development happens.
So what is the upside and what is the downside of the basic income movement adopting the national dividend approach?
Well, the upside's very interesting. They can finance the basic income to a large measure without having to take taxation off anybody and without government or anybody else having to go into debt. Now that is a major consideration. The biggest limitation on getting acceptance of the basic income is how do you finance the thing. If we're going to get a lot of unemployment, those that are employed are going to have to pay a lot of tax. Like once unemployment gets, as they're telling us, it's going to get up to 50% in some decades. So that's the upside. We can finance it, we can do it. The downside is that some vested interests will be disadvantaged. They're very powerful. They dominate the mass media, and the basic income movement is not going to get much help from those quarters. That mightn't even matter in the end because the social media, the other media that's coming with technology, will very likely enable us to do that, on a one-on-one basis.
So what is your take then on technology displacing human employment?
Well, the Brookings Institute tells us that within a couple of decades, unemployment will be 20 or 30%. I think they said in the United States there are 35 million jobs that are going to be replaced with technology. There's another entity called the Institute of New Economic Thinking. They are telling us that by 2060, unemployment will be approximately 100%. It's going to be extremely high. Now, of course, what do you do when unemployment's 50%? If the person that's got a job isn't being paid enough to support two people, then he won't be able to survive. Nobody will be able to survive. And once it goes over that and we start to look at 90%, then the fellow that is employed is going to have to get enough to support 9 people, one part for himself and the rest to be taxed off him for everybody else. And that will mean, yeah, we'll get to 100% pretty quickly. Employing somebody will be so expensive that, they'll be desperate to find technology to replace everybody. So I don't think there's a lot of possibilities. We're either going to go for a national dividend and solve it in that way, or we're going to come to some horrible conclusions and the Luddites will be breaking up the machines, or we'll all be blaming each other, and it could be a pretty horrible world. But we can solve it. All we've got to do is get a little bit of disrespect for the financial powers and begin to speak to them in a manner to which they are not currently accustomed.
Those who control the national money manufacturers and also the media assets which they've acquired will have to put the community's well-being then above their own before the world will hear, of this in sufficient volume.
It's interesting. Everybody acts in their own self-interest. I think it's rational and reasonable that they do so. But self-interest is perceived in many ways. There's a story of the 2 grandsons. One of them looked at his grandma and saw that she had a purse with 50 cents in it. So his idea of his self-interest was to murder his grandmother and take the 50 cents. The other grandson, he knew that lady had a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, and he could benefit greatly from that. So he wanted to cherish his grandmother. Now they're both acting in self-interest. One is immediate and stupid, the other is enlightened and as it should be. So I think with some encouragement, it might be possible to convince those that currently control the issue of money that it just might be a good idea to let society breathe, to let it develop in the way that ordinary people want it to develop, empower people to use their democratic right to vote with an issue of money, to construct the sort of utopia that they want. And that may give us a better world than they can ever imagine. At the moment, they're really tempted to say, well, look, we know best. We think the world should go like this. We think this is the way to do it. But they're probably wrong. I often say, if I had control of Mozart, I'd have probably had him cleaning up after me, and I'd have never recognised his genius, and it would have been lost on the world. So we have to try to get these people to see that there is a higher form of self-interest above and beyond suppressing everybody into their way of seeing everything.
So surely the acquisition of the whole of society's profit by means of chartered banks creating all of that money and exacting tribute for our temporary use of it, isn't that criminal?
What's legal is what the government says is legal, and what's criminal is what the government says is criminal. And I mean, this situation is immoral, it's unjust, it's tyrannical, it's oppressive. But government has made it legal, and government dare not even enter into this area because they're so afraid of financial powers, power of money, and also the power of their media, the influence they can exercise in education, the universities, and all the rest of it. It's a pretty big thing they have to face, and honestly, they're not up to it. Perhaps some societies might be better equipped to handle this than others. The days when a king could do something on his own if he could understand it, they're gone. You have to convince half the population now to make a change. So in that way, it's sort of harder to make a change. we're probably less likely to get bad changes, but good changes, we're also less likely to get them.
We would seem to have to win this contest without the creation or control of money, or any of the power accumulated by unlimited money creation. Is that possible?
I think what's possible is that we just don't lose it. If we don't lose this struggle, we're there tomorrow. And we'd have to lose it forever before it will be denied us. So I think ultimately, by some form of default, we will gain it. How do you end this whole business? So you extinguish the human race? What do? I mean, we're going to still be there at the end of the day. It's going to be unsatisfactory. It's going to be dysfunctional. We're going to have massive unemployment. We're going to have debt that you wouldn't believe. We're going to have all sorts of social problems and so on. If we don't lose the thing completely in some way or another, ultimately the meek will inherit the earth. Yeah, I think I have to believe that.
So how long do you think a widespread knowledge and acceptance of the national dividend will take to develop?
It's a hard one to answer, and one of the really difficult things about it is that in human thought and attitudes, there's a factor of fashion. You know, new ideas can often be pushed away for quite a long time. An example I use, which is just amazing, Tchaikovsky wrote a ballet called Swan Lake, and the Russian ballet company produced it, and it got the thumbs down. And the ballet company in Russia persisted for 6 years, and they did various productions of that, and every one was rubbished. So at the end of that 6 years, they took it off the repertoire. They basically threw it in the bin. But if you ask anybody, you know, what are the most popular ballets ever been written, I mean, Swan Lake is right up there if it's not number one. But for 6 years, it was all rubbish. Now, I think something like that can happen with the national dividend. You know, it's something for nothing. We don't understand it. We push it away. But as the Chinese say, history is a long business. And it's not over yet because we haven't lost the battle. And if we don't lose it, it's still being fought. And on those terms, we've got every prospect of ultimately winning it. We just have to make allowances for people to adjust to those things that are new. I mean, a small number of people have been considering this for 100 years, but 99.9% of people have never heard of a national dividend. And so that's what we're about. And this will be the third video we've made, and I think it'll pretty much explain the concept to a wider audience. If we achieve this, it's going to be a triumph of the human spirit. We're going to have to find the humility to get our heads around this thing and to quietly persist in it. I don't think it's going to be done very quickly, but it's going to be essential, and I think it's eminently winnable because the world and the human economy is not operative if you're going to deny the purchasing power to the public to make the economy operate. It's operated with debt thus far, but we're getting more and more profitable. The profit, because we got all this technology, is going up and up. Every time we get more employment, we take some costs out of consumer goods. So the difference between the value of the goods on the marketplace and the incomes paid is greater. So we're getting more and more profitable. Unemployment is one of the large reasons we're getting profitable. It's regarded as a problem. It's a problem we can solve with the national dividend, and we'll never solve it by increasing debt. So yeah, I think we can do it, and it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when we've had enough. We've got a God-given right to suffer a little more if we don't believe that we've yet suffered enough.